Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition.
It's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
The peace of the Lord is upon us. Joy will be our strength. Lord, be with you this morning. We come to give thanks. Lift your heart. We lift them up. Lift your voice. We lift our song. Lift your heart. We lift them up. Lift your voice. We lift our song. The hope of the Lord is among us. We cast our fear with grace. Dayspring of life, will you guide us? Greet the day with peace. Lift your heart. We lift them up. Lift your voice. We lift our song. Lift your heart. We lift them up. Lift your voice. Lord of creation, we'll praise the Trinity. Christ our incarnate salvation, may we embody thee. Lift your heart, lift your voice, lift your heart. Pray and to break bread, we speak grace and peace. To love God and love our neighbors, we sing for those in need. Lift your heart, lift your voice, lift your heart. Your voice. You are my shepherd. You calm my desires. You lead me down by the river. You restore my soul. Oh, you guide me home through the valley of dry bones. And even though I walk through the valley with the shadow of death around me, I will fear no evil, Lord. And even though I walk through the valley with the shadow of death around me, I will fear no evil, Lord. You prepare a table in the midst of the battle for saints and sinners all together. We break your bread and we crush your vine. I take your heart in place of mine. And even though I walk through the valley with the shadow of death around me, I will fear no evil, Lord. And even though I walk through the valley with the shadow of death around me, I will fear no evil, Lord. Surely your love and your mercy will guide and direct me and follow me forever. I'll live in your presence. Your arms always welcome your children home. Surely your love and your mercy will guide and direct me and follow me forever. I'll live in your presence. Your arms always welcome your children home. With the shadow of death around me, I will fear no evil, Lord. And even though I walk through the valley with the shadow of death around me, I will fear no evil, Lord. I will no evil, Lord. I will fear no evil, Lord.
Good morning, Crosspointe. A few things to make you aware of today. We are partnering with Operation Nayel to collect toiletries for homeless individuals in Apex and Fuquay-Varina. We're collecting items this morning during our in-person service in Cary from 9:30 to 11:30, or items can be delivered by October 30th to Crosspointe Church, attention, toiletry drive. On Sunday, October 31st, Kids Point is holding their second annual trunk or treat in the Crosspointe parking lot. Families can come in costumes, park, and walk through to get a treat from each decorated trunk. Drop by anytime from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and invite your friends. Masks are required for everyone. There are lots of ways that you can partner with us financially. You can mail checks, set up automatic bank drafts, pay through PayPal or our online tool Connect. You can also text crosspointenc to 77977 for a link to pay directly through your phone. No matter how you contribute, all of it allows all of Crosspointe together to continue loving on our community in lots of beautiful ways. Finally, we're going to participate in communion together today. To do this, you are going to want to have a small morsel to eat, such as a cracker, a piece of bread, really, it can be anything, as well as a drink of some sort, juice, water, whatever you have on hand. In just a moment, we're going to give you 60 seconds to go ahead and collect those two things so that you will be ready to join us in communion with our community. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, everybody. As Kim said, I hope you can grab some bread and juice or something close to that, as we will join millions of others in a few moments to remember the broken body and spilled blood of Jesus in communion. That'll happen at the end of our service together. For now, I'd like to continue our series on Jesus' parables. We're calling it True Fictions. And Tirza is teaching a different parable for our in-person service today, but for us here on Team Pajamas, we're going to engage with a very different one, a very short parable. And not only short, but one that the author of the Gospel of John completely explains. So, John chapter 2 reads, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables." So we should stop here in the text and say that what is often pointed out in this scene is that Jesus is being violent. This passage is what Calvin pointed to in defense of why he burned a man alive. But Jesus isn't being violent. The precise interpretation of the Greek text that I've just quoted says that Jesus used the whip on the animals. If you have any experience with livestock, you know you can't just talk to them and get them moving as soon as you want to. So it says he drives out the sheep and the cattle with the whip. He does not hurt people, let alone whip them. I don't even think he hurt the animals. Jesus does not cause hurt. And it reads elsewhere in the other Gospels that the people in power, quote, kept trying to obtain evidence against Jesus in order to put him to death. They're trying to make accusations against him that'll get him arrested and executed. Of all the accusations they leveled against him, being violent in the temple or anywhere else, that never made the list. And this isn't just a tangent. I'm actually hoping to build on this point a great deal about Jesus and whether or not he's violent and what we can take from that. So he makes this whip and does a get along little doggies to the animals offered for sacrifice in the temple. And then verse 16 continues, he told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Get them out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "Well, what sign can you show us for doing this? Like, where do you get off?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years. And will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, the disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. The lights typically go on way later. So before we think about this parable and dig into it a little bit, I want to briefly talk about the temple in which he's standing, where he calls himself a temple. Because we've talked about the Roman Empire and how huge it is, how much stuff was inside its ever-expanding borders. But the temple in Jerusalem, this is the largest sacred site in the whole empire. The Temple Mount had already existed since back in the days of King Solomon, so generations and generations before the time of Jesus. But right before Jesus was born, King Herod expanded the size of the temple area. So the Temple Mount Plaza that Jesus walked around in, by that point, it was 172,000 square yards, which I'm told is the equivalent of 29 American football fields all stitched together end to end. And I tell you this to give us a renewed sense that this isn't some obscure religious place to try to find on a map if you were in town. This was arguably the biggest tourist destination on earth in that time, and a huge concern for the Roman Empire that oversaw things there. And so Jesus, like the rest of his family and his kinsmen, they're very fond of the temple. And maybe that comes as a surprise to you, because many of us have learned that there's something inherently wrong about the temple and a lot of other things that the Jews celebrated then. And I'm still coming to recognize that all of that is rooted in the idea that the Jewish faith was fundamentally deficient, and Christianity corrected it or completed those deficiencies. But that's not true, and it's not good. Jesus refers to the temple as his Father's house. Jesus is presented in the Gospels as valuing his Father's house, the role of the temple in Jewish life, and as thinking there was something deeply sacred about it, and much of what happened there being deeply sacred. So he's not against it. He actually defends it. And yet there's a system at work within it that Jesus rails against, that some argue is the reason people wanted him dead. So in the passage I just read, he gives this parable about his body being the temple. His beef that these people and the money changers are turning the temple into a marketplace, we have to consider that carefully. That somehow they're relegating it to a business center. But that's not exactly it. Money changing and selling animals were not bad in and of themselves. They were actually welcome services by Jewish people who'd come to the temple. And it seems like there's countless sermons and commentaries that explain otherwise, that they say that, well, the problem was that the money changers were there in the first place. And not only there, but they're price gouging, taking advantage of the poor. And it's possible that happened here and there. But the text doesn't say anything about that. That is actually wild, unsubstantiated speculation. And it's a belief, I think, is again rooted in the idea that the Jewish people of this time are morally deficient somehow, waiting for Christianity to fix them. But there's plenty of reason to actually believe that these people looked out for each other and had regulations on the service, the money changing, the animals. There's little to no reason to believe that anyone would have tolerated their kinsmen jacking up prices exorbitantly to take advantage of anyone at any point, let alone during the Passover. So consider that people are traveling from very far away to go to Jerusalem at Passover. A lot of people never even got to do this ever in their lives. But for those who did, they're bringing their best, most perfect, healthy animals to the temple for sacrifice. They're very likely not wealthy, and the animals that they had to offer weren't numerous to start with. Well, it's expensive to travel with animals. And to travel with animals that you have to keep alive and fed and healthy. I mean, it's dangerous if you want to go 100 miles on foot with your prize oxen or a cage full of doves. They're very likely to get wounded or sick or blemished before you get to the temple to offer them. So money changers are changing money into the temple currency that they use. And those selling animals are providing a very welcome service of healthy animals for ritual sacrifice to obtain once you get there. And whatever other issues you might have with the practice of animal sacrifice, and all the other things that we could say about money changing and selling animals, because there's more nuance, as you can imagine, Jesus isn't likely railing against those things happening in the temple. He's far more likely to be making a statement about who is doing it. So I want to look at the parallel story in Matthew, the 21st chapter, because it's probably the same story. It says Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all those who were selling and buying at the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written," so he's quoting, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." So, slightly different language in this version, because he probably said a lot of things, but Matthew is highlighting something different than John did. So it's a different point being highlighted, but it's likely he said all this. But pay attention to what Jesus is saying as he throws his temple tantrum. He says to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." These two phrases are taken from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, already 7 centuries or so by the time that Jesus is speaking. From Isaiah 56, he states that the temple is to be a house of prayer for all the nations, but has instead become a, Jeremiah 7, den of robbers. A house of prayer for all the nations is this remarkable idea, especially considering the time. Because for centuries before Jesus, there's this vision that no matter who you are, where you come from, the temple is a place that you could come and gather and really tune in. Anyone on earth could come and pray and meditate and wake up to their connection to the divine. Anyone. And a world full of temples and shrines and esoteric rites and private sanctuaries. And sure, the temple in Jerusalem definitely had exclusivity as you got further into the center of it. But the temple of God of the Hebrews was supposed to be a place, primarily, where any human in the human family could come and know reconciliation, the removal of shame, all while gaining a renewed sense that our separation from ourselves and from God is this disastrous illusion that we can wake up from. Anybody could come. But Jesus says it's become not that. He says to these particular people, you've tarnished that vision. You've made it a den of robbers. And this is where many of us, we took off our thinking caps for some reason, and we didn't know that we did it. He says, you've made it a den of robbers. And we think, aha, see, he's saying that people are being robbed right there in the temple by these robbers. But a den, or some translations say cave, that's the only place robbers don't rob. The den of robbers is where robbers hide after they've robbed somewhere else. He's not accusing them of crime in the temple. He's accusing them of being criminals hiding in the temple. So note that Jesus is referencing an old passage from Jeremiah when he says this. And I want you to see what he subtly, not so subtly, is referencing. In Jeremiah 7, God is speaking directly to the people of Israel, people of faith, the people who go to the temple and worship God. And God says to this particular group of people, if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly with one another, if you do not oppress the alien or the stranger, the immigrant, the orphan and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. Here you are, trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal and murder and commit adultery and swear falsely, make false accusations, and make offerings to Baal? This is a fertility god that people would pray to and beg for rain if, their own god didn't comply with their timeline. And go after other gods that you have not known. That's the gist of adultery too. And then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, whew, we're safe. Only to go on doing these abominations. He tells people of faith in this ancient prophecy of Jeremiah that if they take care of those that either misfortune or abuse has crushed, then they are the very ones who can legitimately expect to enjoy the presence of the divine in the temple. But then there are these hard words for them who are stealing, who kill or wish that they could and get away with it, who abandon their families for some selfish fling, who make false accusations that destroy others for their own benefit, who give themselves over to whatever powers make them the most enticing promises, who essentially act like animals toward one another. And then they come to the temple and say, I'm not perfect, just forgiven. They think they can do all this, and before any consequences can tag them, they put their hand on the temple and yell out, safe. And so here's the very next line from the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 7, verse 11. Has this house, this temple, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You know I too am watching, says the Lord. You think you can hide here and keep lookout? You know I'm a lookout too on behalf of all those lives that you make worse with your hypocrisy. The word robber here in the ancient Hebrew isn't just like a pickpocket, like not a thief. Robber here is a picture that includes violence, like a mugger or a carjacker or somebody. So it says that the temple has become a den of robbers. It's saying that the temple has become a hideout for directly or indirectly violent criminals. In Jeremiah's day and in Jesus' day, people were, if you can imagine such a thing happening, if you possess the creativity to really conjure circumstances like these, people were coming to this place to check a box and then going right back outside the temple and abusing others or endorsing the abuse of others or ignoring that others were being abused. They were going right back out and victim blaming. Well, if they were just right with God, or if they had more faith, or if they just worked harder, and if they don't like it, they can leave and all that. They'd go right back outside the temple to participate in and defend and nurture systems that keep life miserable for others, for vulnerable others. And God says, you think this temple is a hideout for pillagers? You know I see you, don't you? Jesus isn't angry about markets set up in the temple. Jesus is angry because there's an entire system in play that keeps poor and hurting people poor and hurting. A system that forcefully pushes down on people, oppressing and suppressing them, taking advantage of them, shaming them, blaming them, but then pretends this isn't happening once they're in the temple. Jesus isn't angry about the band selling CDs in the church sanctuary. He's not angry about money changing or even the sale of animals per se. Jesus is calling out what he often called out, death-dealing hypocrisy. So he puts on this demonstration and calls them out and flips over the tables, drives out the animals. And the elites who work in collusion with the empire that oppresses people, they don't defend themselves. They just ask to see Jesus' credentials. Wait, can you give us a sign? Because we know deep down what we're doing is gross, but we can't tell if you're a complainer or a judge. So let's fast forward. This is a great example of why we cannot any longer insist that politics stay out of church. I hear it weekly. The church isn't the temple, I know, and sure, partisan politics, that generally that's a disease. I get that. But politics are a discussion about power. Who has it, who doesn't? And the mindset that says what happens and affects people out there cannot be discussed in here, in the temple, in church, because this is about private spirituality, and out there, that's the world. That distinction is one that's maintained by those of us who have it going the best. Those of us in power enjoy keeping politics out of our religion because we can survive the illusion that there's a distinction. This is also why we can no longer pretend, as I did for so many years, without understanding what I was doing. I am part of this. We can no longer believe that neutrality is a kingdom value, that being the middle space for both sides, to come and sit at the same table and let the world and its worldly problems fade away. I mean, sure, there's something in there worth discussing, but generally speaking, this just isn't realistic. And it's not just. And it's rarely as good as it seems. Imagine Jesus flipping over those tables and yet saying, I don't take sides. We have to acknowledge that calls for unity are not uniquely Christian values, and that unity itself isn't inherently good. I mean, I love it when unity is possible, but too often unity is a silencing method. It's too often the preservation of inequality and the status quo, because what it does is it tells those who need systemic change, who need somebody to pay attention to how badly it's going for them, they're told to shut up and worship, without directly addressing power imbalances in economics or race or sex or age or ability or disability, nation of origin, climate, all of that. Without directly addressing these things, the church it can't call itself a voice of love and justice and reconciliation. It's a hideout. It's a hideout. So a really weighty shift occurs in the Gospels, and Jesus says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And as it turns out, he was referencing himself. Not because the temple was bad, but because what happens there is impossible in what he was offering in himself. That is to say, you and I cannot crush our human siblings and be confused for Jesus. We can't hide like that. We can claim to be Christians or faithful or good or right or at least better than so-and-so, but you and I cannot be unloving and unjust and look like Jesus. You can't hide. He said his body was the temple. The first followers called themselves parts of the temple. The apostles were the pillars. Believers and doubters are the bricks and the mortar, all belonging to one another. This is a huge, game-changing shift. If the temple is Jesus and the temple is us, then there's nowhere to hide. It's all here in our midst, in our living. There's no room for such tragic duplicity, no false secular sacred divide, no more spiritual and unspiritual distinctions, no more illusions about how we treat others and then our religious life, like those are different conversations. No more I love God without that being completely and entirely connected to how I love my neighbors and my enemies. It's all one thing. If the temple is Jesus and is us and there's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to hide. That's only bad news for those of us hoping to nurture two lives. There's nowhere to hide. Our lives are the temple. Our lives are the priesthood. Our lives are the altar. Our lives are the sacrifice. Our lives are the offering. Our lives are the city on the hill. Our lives are our belief system. Paul said it like this to his friends in Rome. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your well-considered offering. Don't be conformed to this society, but be transformed by the renewing of your thinking so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly than you ought to think of yourself, but to think of yourself with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. Most of us don't quite have the influence that Jesus called out in his demonstration in the temple. But we do often forget that we're members of one another. We belong to each other, that our actions are connected, our fates intertwined. We forget that. Well, the way of Christ is the ongoing way of learning to put forth our whole lives as an offering of love and justice and faith. We don't have two lives, one out there and one at the temple. Everywhere we go as fellow human participants in a living temple, a living altar. All of it becomes holy ground. We allow ourselves to see each other sacredly, to see our actions and our decisions in our common world as loaded with the power to heal and bless. We see our own lives as the very location where prayer and reconciliation occur, where heaven and earth touch, where creator and created overlap like a divine Venn diagram. There's no threat in any of this unless being seen feels threatening. See, I think communion is supposed to be arresting. because we can't just belly up and pretend like the rest of our life doesn't matter as long as we show up for the snack and the ceremony. No, if we're considering eating this meal, we are saying that we need grace and that we intend to be participants in that grace wherever we are. That our religious life and our social life and our eating life and our work life and all the different facets of ourselves will be free of the mistreatment of others. Communion is as much remembering the cross and the new covenant as it is a proclamation that we're participants in His body along with everybody else. That we comprise His mobile temple and that we want Him present and recognizable in our love and our grace and our justice and our honesty. And to the degree that we get all this wrong and fall short, as we're going to often, well, we don't hide. We don't pretend. We don't attempt to split our lives in two, hoping to fool God with one half, while with the other half just, business as usual, continuing to be desperate takers. No, we remember to think of ourselves with sober judgment. We reset ourselves with reminders of God's love and forgiveness. We remember to see ourselves and others with grace, to see others with the love and the justice that we want for ourselves, and we amend our ways. We remember the gift of communion so that we might offer ourselves in love and justice and kindness and peace to others in return. So for the next few moments, I hope that you'll eat the bread or the cracker or whatever you have, and that you'll drink the cup of juice or wine or whatever you have on hand, and remember to think soberly of yourself as eating this meal connected to countless others. Think of yourself as seen, as known, as having one life that's not only loved by God, but as a co-member of the very body and temple of love itself, a fellow brick in the temple where non-stop contact with the Spirit of Christ is known to be. Eat the bread and drink the cup, mindful that we're all in this together, each of us co-participants in this messy, perfectly imperfect life of the love of Jesus. And as we consider this, know that we are waking up to the very sort of life He had in mind and continues to invite us into.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.